A waitress? You expect me to allow my only son to marry a girl who cleans tables? Not in this life, not while I'm breathing. Richard Worthington didn't yell those words in private. He declared them in front of his family, his staff, and the entire marble hall of his countryside estate, like a king throwing down judgment. The dining room fell into silence. Forks paused midair, eyes shifted, and just beyond the archway, standing with a silver tray in hand, Sarah stood still, having heard every single word. She'd worked at the Worthington estate for just over 6 months, discreet, polite, efficient. She served tea and cleared dishes while pretending not to notice the way certain guests looked through her. It was a role she had accepted, not out of desperation, but out of choice. And now, the truth of how the man at the top of the empire saw her was out in the open. Daniel, Richard's only son, stood like a stone. His knuckles were white where he gripped the edge of the dining table. His voice came low and steady. "I love her." Richard scoffed. "You think love makes up for bloodline, for legacy, for the billions I've spent keeping this family name untouchable? Do you know what it would mean to marry her, a waitress, a black girl with no pedigree, no background?" Daniel's jaw clenched. "Her name is Sarah, and she's more than you'll ever see." "She's nothing," Richard said, eyes narrowing. "She brings food to the table. That's where her role ends." In the corner, Sarah stood still, frozen not from fear, but from restraint. Not once did she blink. Not once did she let the tears win. She'd heard worse. She'd survived worse. But in all her years walking through power, she had never been so publicly discarded. And yet, she knew something Richard didn't. Sarah wasn't just a waitress. She was the daughter of President Elizabeth Monroe, the sitting head of the nation, a woman known for her calm brilliance, quiet intensity, and razor-sharp political grip. A woman who had raised Sarah not to rule, but to understand power from the inside out. But Sarah had rejected the public eye. She didn't want her life shaped by tabloids, forced friendships, or empty luxury. She wanted truth, realness, a life away from the flashbulbs and bodyguards. So she had changed her name, dressed down, walked into places where no one knew her last name, and she'd taken a job, here, in the home of a billionaire who would later call her nothing. Richard turned to the butler. "Have her removed, now, and tell security to blacklist her from the property." Daniel pushed back his chair. "If she goes, I go too." "Then go," Richard bellowed. "Throw your future away for a passing fling. You think she loves you? She loves the money. You're a fool if you can't see that." Sarah didn't wait for more. She set the tray down softly, then looked Richard in the eyes. Her voice was steady, controlled. "Thank you for showing me who you really are." She turned and walked out. No scene, no shouting, just dignity. The kind of dignity you don't buy. You're born into it. The kind that doesn't need validation, that says more in silence than others say in rage. That evening, Daniel didn't come down for dinner. Richard pretended not to notice. But beneath the surface, something twisted. At precisely 7:02 the next morning, the landline rang. It hadn't rung in years. It was one of only 4 secure government lines that ran directly through the estate's communication network. Richard answered it, annoyed. "This is Worthington." There was no hesitation, no greeting, just a voice. "You insulted my daughter." Richard frowned. "Excuse me?" "You insulted my daughter," the voice repeated. "Her name is Sarah Monroe, and she is not just anyone." Silence. Then a second voice entered the call, softer, familiar. "I told him you'd call," Sarah said, calmly. Richard's breath caught. "You made a lot of assumptions, Mr. Worthington," Sarah continued. "I chose to serve in your house, not because I had to, but because I wanted to see how men like you speak when no one's watching." He said nothing. "The next time we speak," she added, "it will be through your attorneys and the media." The line went dead. For the first time in decades, Richard Worthington didn't know what to say. He had not humiliated a waitress. He had declared war on the most protected woman in the country. Richard Worthington sat at the head of the long, empty dining table, the same place he'd delivered his infamous words just 2 days ago. The house was quieter than usual, not with peace, but with dread. The staff walked carefully, speaking in hushed tones. Daniel hadn't come down. His mother had left for the city without a word. And Richard was waiting. Waiting for something he couldn't name. Or rather, something he was trying not to name. He had tried to dismiss the phone call as a bluff, some political stunt, some minor misunderstanding. But the more he replayed Sarah's voice in his head, the clearer it became. She hadn't been bluffing. She had spoken like someone who had learned to aim her words like weapons. By 10 a.m., the silence broke. Not with another phone call, not with the sound of a car, or a voice, or a knock. It broke with a headline. Daniel came into the study without knocking, holding up his phone. "Dad, you need to see this." Richard turned, took the phone from his son's hand, and felt his stomach twist the moment he read the first few words. Exclusive. Billionaire Richard Worthington humiliates president's daughter. Calls her just a waitress. Below the headline was a still image, a blurry surveillance frame from inside the dining room. Richard's jaw frozen mid-sentence. Sarah in the corner, face unreadable, holding the silver tray. The story was already spreading. One by one, the other media outlets followed. By noon, it was on the front page of nearly every major paper in the country. By 5 p.m., 3 of his real estate partners had issued press releases condemning classism and racially motivated language in business spaces. By 6, an ethics committee had announced a formal review of several of Worthington's public contracts, including the controversial downtown redevelopment deal that he had spent years lobbying for. Daniel stood across the room, arms folded, face unreadable. "She told you who she was. You didn't listen." Richard stared at the wall. His pride, that high wall he'd built to separate himself from the world, was cracking. "She played us," he muttered. Daniel's eyes narrowed. "No. She watched us." By the next morning, the story was no longer about Richard. It was about Sarah. And this time, she wasn't silent. A viral video clip from a graduation speech surfaced online. Sarah Monroe, valedictorian at Georgetown Law, delivering a powerful address about learning to walk through powerful rooms with quiet dignity. A second clip followed. Sarah at the UN Youth Summit, speaking fluently in 3 languages. Then came the op-eds. Why Sarah Monroe chose silence over status. Power, Race, and the Worthington Scandal. What it tells us about elite hypocrisy. Talk shows dissected her posture, her grace, her control. They compared it to Richard's fury, his arrogance, his downfall. By the end of the week, Sarah Monroe was more than a name. She was a national symbol. But she wasn't chasing the spotlight. She refused every interview, declined every brand partnership, issued only one public statement through her mother's press secretary. I do not seek revenge. I seek accountability. Silence should not be mistaken for insignificance. The impact was nuclear. Investors began pulling out of Worthington Holdings. 2 board members resigned, and quietly, one of his longtime legal advisors warned him, "You may want to consider stepping down as chairman, at least temporarily, to protect what's left of your brand." Richard refused. At first, he'd built his empire with nothing but grit and cold strategy. He had crushed competitors, outbid oil giants, bribed senators, navigated scandal after scandal. But this was different. This was not a hostile takeover or a market crash. This was a young woman, one he had completely dismissed, becoming the one person he couldn't buy, threaten, or silence. Daniel, meanwhile, had packed his things. His room, once full of luxury, designer watches, custom suits, sports memorabilia, was half empty by the time Richard found him. "You're really leaving?" Richard asked. Daniel didn't even look up. "You've built a world that doesn't have room for real people." "She lied to you. She pretended to be someone else." Daniel finally turned. "And you pretended to be better than you are. She's not the one who lied, Dad. You are." Richard stepped forward. "You'd throw away your inheritance over her?" "I'd rather build something from scratch than inherit something rotting." The words stung more than expected. Daniel walked out with a single duffel bag and a clean heart. He didn't call the press, he didn't post on social media, he just left, for a life he chose, not one dictated by legacy. A week passed. Then 2. Richard kept his public silence, hoping the scandal would die down. But it didn't. What he hadn't accounted for, what men like him never account for, was memory. People remembered how easily he said the words, how coldly he had dismissed a woman based on her job, her skin, her name, and how wrong he had been. One morning, a letter arrived at the estate. Heavy paper, gold seal. It wasn't from Sarah. It was from the office of the president. Inside was a formal notice. Richard's invitation to attend the Global Infrastructure Summit had been revoked in light of recent ethical concerns. It was a final elegant slap in the face, the kind that left no bruise, but left everyone watching. The same week, Sarah was spotted attending that same summit, at her mother's side, standing tall in a tailored blue dress, taking notes, offering quiet counsel. No smile, no gloating, just presence. Power in its purest, calmest form. Behind closed doors, Richard began to unravel. He fired 3 members of his PR team in a single afternoon, threatened lawsuits, called in favors from old senators who no longer returned his calls. But the worst blow came 2 days later, when a leaked internal email from a UN diplomat revealed that Sarah Monroe had quietly recommended her father's administration withdraw federal development grants from Worthington's overseas projects. No press release, no public shame, just quiet, systematic dismantling. Richard had gone to war with someone who didn't fight the way he was used to. Sarah didn't shout, she didn't gloat. She simply removed the oxygen from every room he once controlled. By the end of the 3rd week, Richard Worthington stepped down from his company. The statement read, "To focus on my family and reflect on the values we must hold ourselves accountable to." It was a lie, of course, but a necessary one. Inside, Richard felt something he hadn't felt in decades. Fear. Not of bankruptcy, not of prison, but of irrelevance. One afternoon, long after the cameras had moved on, Richard sat alone on the estate balcony. He hadn't seen Daniel since he left, hadn't heard from any of his allies. The world had shrunk. But in the distance, on a glowing laptop screen, he watched Sarah walk across a quiet university campus, laughing with students, carrying a book under her arm. She hadn't destroyed him. She had simply continued living, untouched, unbothered, and more powerful than ever. And in that quiet moment, for the first time in his life, Richard understood what true power looked like. Not money, not control, but the ability to walk away from a man like him and still rise higher. It had been 8 months since Richard Worthington's name vanished from the front pages. The world, as always, had moved on, chasing newer scandals, fresher headlines. But silence wasn't mercy. It was exile. He still lived in the mansion, but the staff had thinned. The estate grounds, once flawless, had started to fray at the edges. The fountains weren't cleaned as often. The garden was missing its usual bloom. Even the wine cellar, once stocked with the finest vintages, had gone quiet. The board had moved forward without him. Worthington Holdings still bore his name, but none of his decisions. He had become what he feared most, a figurehead with no influence. But it wasn't just the business world that had turned. It was his own home. Daniel had not returned. There were no texts, no letters, not even a birthday call. For the first few months, Richard convinced himself the silence was temporary. His son was just being dramatic, a phase, a lesson. But that illusion cracked when Richard received a wedding invitation in the mail. His name was not printed on it. Instead, it was handwritten on the envelope in Daniel's unmistakable penmanship. Inside, the card was simple and elegant. Daniel Worthington and Sarah Monroe request the honor of your presence. The rest of the words blurred as Richard read them. They were getting married. In 2 months. In Vermont. And they had invited him, not out of obligation, not with warmth, but with the cold, painful grace of people who had grown beyond his reach.
For weeks, he didn't respond. He paced the halls, rereading the invitation, drinking more than usual, dialing Daniel's number and hanging up before it rang. One night, he found himself standing in Daniel's old bedroom. The posters still hung on the walls, the dusty tennis trophies, the bookshelf Sarah once rearranged during a quiet afternoon back when she was just the help. Richard sat down on the edge of the bed and allowed himself to whisper the truth. I ruined everything. The walls said nothing. Elsewhere, hundreds of miles away, Sarah stood in front of a mirror, adjusting a delicate silver earring. She didn't look like the waitress who had once stood humiliated in a mansion. She looked exactly like who she had always been, composed, intelligent, and in control. But beneath the calm, there was uncertainty. Are you sure you want to invite him? She had asked Daniel weeks earlier. I don't want to, Daniel admitted, but I need to. Why? Because I need to prove to myself that I'm no longer afraid of becoming him. Sarah had nodded, understanding more than he knew. The wedding was held in early spring, a private garden surrounded by tall birch trees. No paparazzi, no grand political spectacle, just a quiet ceremony shielded by nature and intention. Richard arrived late. He hadn't RSVP'd, he hadn't called, but when he stepped out of the black sedan, dressed in a simple gray suit instead of his usual custom tailoring, no one stopped him. Sarah saw him first, across the courtyard, standing awkwardly near the edge, away from the chairs. She didn't flinch, she didn't look away. She simply nodded, once, in acknowledgement. It wasn't forgiveness, but it wasn't hate either. Daniel turned, saw his father, and didn't smile, but didn't walk away. The ceremony began. Vows were exchanged under a soft canopy of white blossoms, no fanfare, no orchestra, just words that carried weight. When Sarah said, I do, She wasn't just choosing Daniel. She was choosing a future untouched by shame, by control, by legacy that didn't serve her. When Daniel said, "I do," he wasn't just pledging love. He was severing the last string that had ever tied him to the world his father had built. And Richard stood silently in the shadows, watching the two people he had once tried to separate become untouchable to him, not because of politics or status, but because of growth. They had grown beyond him. After the ceremony, guests mingled under strings of soft lights. There were no high-profile politicians, no tycoons, just people. Artists, lawyers, young idealists, college friends. A different kind of elite, not based on wealth, but on thought. Richard stayed to the side, unsure if he would be asked to leave. But then Sarah walked towards him, not alone, never vulnerable, but unflinching. "Thank you for coming," she said. "I wasn't sure I should." You weren't invited to celebrate. You were invited to witness. There was no venom in her voice, no satisfaction, just clarity. "I suppose I deserve that," he said. She didn't answer. Instead, she looked at him the way one looks at a closed book, not with anger, but with finality. "I hope you understand something, Mr. Worthington," she said softly. "I never wanted to destroy you. I know, you just didn't stop it from happening." Sarah smiled faintly. "I didn't start it either." And with that, she turned and rejoined her guests, her world, leaving Richard in a space where he no longer belonged. Weeks passed. Daniel and Sarah left for a quiet honeymoon abroad. The headlines had died, the spotlight shifted. But in every influential room, Sarah's name still carried a silent kind of power, not because of who her mother was, but because of what she hadn't done. She hadn't lashed out. She hadn't gone on talk shows or sold her story. She had simply lived better.
And people remembered that. One day, Richard received a letter. No envelope, no name. Just a single handwritten page left on his desk by someone he never saw. It read, "You taught me to fear weakness, but Sarah taught me the strength in grace. I hope someday you understand the difference. D.W." It was the last thing he ever received from his son. Back in the city, Sarah stood at the front of a classroom, guest lecturing a group of second-year law students on ethical leadership. She didn't talk about her father. She didn't talk about Richard. She talked about dignity. "Sometimes," she said, "the most powerful thing you can do is not respond. Not because you're afraid, but because you know who you are." A girl in the front row raised her hand. "Is that what makes you powerful?" Sarah smiled. "No," she replied. "That's what makes me free." It started with the mirror. A small one, mounted in the guest bathroom at the far end of the Worthington estate. Untouched, seldom used. Richard caught his reflection in it one morning. He didn't recognize what he saw. The sharpness in his jaw had softened. His once perfect hair had turned mostly gray. His eyes that used to command boardrooms, were dull, fogged with sleepless nights and decades of control slipping through his fingers. He looked old. Not in years, but in relevance. He had always feared death, yes, but not the kind that stopped the heart. He feared the kind that made a man invisible in rooms where he once ruled. That morning, something shifted. Not regret, not yet, but the realization that the world had moved forward without him, and it was never coming back. In the city, Sarah and Daniel were building something new. They had moved into a brownstone on the east side, not far from the universities, the museums, the old neighborhoods being transformed by thought and passion, not just money. Daniel had quietly started his own consulting firm, a small outfit that focused on advising ethical startups. He refused investor money from corporations with poor labor records. He declined offers from friends who wanted to use his last name. The business was slow to grow, but solid, clean. Sarah had become a fixture in law schools and leadership forums. She didn't run for office. She didn't want power in the traditional sense. But people listened when she spoke, not because of who her parents were, but because of how she made them feel. Every talk, every panel, every interview, she carried herself like someone who had already won and didn't need you to know it. One night, Daniel found her sitting on the roof of their home, wrapped in a shawl, sipping tea, eyes on the skyline. He sat beside her. "You okay?" She nodded. "Just thinking." "About?" She took a long breath. "About your father." Daniel tensed. "You still think about him?" Sarah turned to him slowly. "He's part of the story, not the end of it." Daniel looked down. "I haven't spoken to him since the wedding." "I know." "Do you think I should?" Sarah didn't answer. Instead, she asked, "Do you want to?" He thought about it. He thought about the way his father used to stand like a statue in his office, staring out the window like he owned the sky. He thought about the silence at dinner, the weight of legacy shoved onto him like armor. He thought about the words that split their relationship in two. "She is not our kind." And yet, "I don't know what I'd say," Daniel admitted. "Sometimes," she said, "it's not about what you say. It's about what you choose to leave unsaid." Weeks passed. Richard remained in the mansion, but something had changed. His days were now slower. He had stopped fighting for control, stopped calling old partners, stopped reading the stock reports. Instead, he read books, mostly history, sometimes biographies, and once, though he wouldn't admit it out loud, he read an entire article about Sarah's work in restorative justice. She was building something, and unlike him, she wasn't building it to be remembered.
She was building it to be useful. One afternoon, he went into the cellar and pulled out a dusty wooden chest. Inside were old photos, Daniel as a boy, Richard's late wife smiling in sunlight, handwritten letters from clients, memories he'd buried beneath the empire. He stayed there for hours. And when he finally climbed the stairs, he looked 10 years older and 10 pounds lighter. That night, he wrote a letter. Daniel received it by post. The envelope was unmarked, the handwriting shaky. Inside, only one sentence. "I don't ask you to forgive me, only to see me as I am now, not as I was." No signature, no plea, just a whisper from a man unlearning everything he once believed was true. Daniel folded the letter and slipped it into a drawer. He didn't tell Sarah, not right away. 3 months later, a large donation was made to Sarah's foundation, anonymously, enough to fund 20 full scholarships and expand legal aid to 3 underserved cities. She didn't ask where the money came from, but when she opened the foundation's handwritten thank you note to the donor, she noticed something strange. It had been returned, unopened, addressed to a name she hadn't seen in months, R. Worthington. In early autumn, Richard made a decision. He called his driver, the only one still employed, and asked to be taken to the university where Sarah was speaking. It was a panel on wealth and justice, redefining power in a post-patriarchal society. He sat quietly in the back, surrounded by young people, activists, thinkers. No one recognized him. No one cared who he used to be. He watched Sarah speak,
She stood tall, confident, dressed simply but with presence. Her voice was measured, calm, but every word struck like truth. "Real power," she said, "doesn't come from being feared. It comes from being trusted. And trust is only earned when we acknowledge the harm we've caused and work to make it right." There was no applause break, just silence. The good kind. The kind that meant people were listening. After the talk, he didn't approach her. He walked back to the car, sat in the back seat, and closed his eyes. And for the first time in decades, he smiled. Not because he felt proud, but because he felt relieved. He no longer had to pretend. The empire was gone, the spotlight gone. But somewhere out there, beyond his reach, his son and the woman he once tried to erase were building a world he could never have imagined. And maybe that was enough. A year passed. Daniel and Sarah welcomed their first child, a daughter named Elise. Richard never met her, but a small wooden box arrived on the day she was born. No return address, just a single item inside. A faded black and white photo of Daniel as a baby, held by his mother, smiling in sunlight. No note, no explanation, just a quiet offering. And that brings us to the end of the journey. Whether it made you think, laugh, or see things from a new angle, I hope you found something meaningful in it. Every story leaves us with something, a lesson, a feeling, or simply a moment to reflect. With that said, thanks for watching. Hit that like button, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. And until next time,